Was it the heat that silenced the village, or a collective holding of breath against the weight of the Andalusian summer? Elena stood in the doorway of her ceramics shop, the boundary between the cool, clay-dusted interior and the blinding white plaza shimmering like water. 48 years, she thought, tracing the rim of a rough terracotta bowl with a fingertip. 48 summers like this, each hotter, heavier, pressing down until the air itself felt solid. The cicadas buzzed, a relentless, metallic soaring that frayed the edges of silence. Tourists drifted past, their bright clothes alien against the whitewashed walls, their voices sharp and fleeting. They paused, peered, sometimes bought a postcard pretty bowl, glazed in the predictable blues and yellows. They never saw the dust gathering on the more ambitious shapes huddled in the back corner, shapes born from a different, quieter impulse. Her hands, strong and stained with the earth's colours, clenched slightly. Capable hands. Hands that knew the secret language of clay, its yielding and its resistance. Lately, they felt hesitant, clumsy, when reaching for anything else. The bell above the door jingled, a sound swallowed instantly by the heat. Carlos. He didn't look at the pottery, his eyes scanning the plaza as if assessing crop yields. "The pump for the well," he said, his voice practical, devoid of preamble. "It's making that noise again. Garcia thinks it might give out before the week is done." He smelled faintly of dust and olives, a scent so familiar it was almost invisible. He ran the family's small olive oil business, a legacy heavy with responsibility. "I heard it this morning," Elena replied, her gaze falling on a smudge of grey clay on his sleeve he hadn't noticed. "We need rain." "Rain," he echoed, a dry sound like leaves skittering across baked earth. "Wishing won't bring it. I need to go out to the groves again after siesta. Make sure the irrigation lines are holding." He paused, his gaze finally settling on her, but not truly seeing. "Don't stay out in the sun too long." It was his version of caring, practical and grounded. He turned, the bell jingling his departure, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Elena retreated into the shop's shadowed depths. In the back, near her wheel, stood an unfinished sculpture. Abstract, challenging, it leaned precariously, like a question mark solidified in clay. Years ago, after the silence that followed the loss, the miscarriage they never truly spoke of, she had started it. It remained unfinished, a monument to a grief navigated alone, a barrier built of unspoken words between her and Carlos. She ran a hand over its cool, rough surface. What story did it want to tell? And who was left to listen? The afternoon deepened, the siesta hours draping the Pueblo Blanco in a profound stillness. Even the cicadas seemed subdued. Elena sat at her wheel, but her hands were idle. The lump of clay remained stubbornly inert. Outside, the heat baked the stones, the scent of jasmine thick and cloying. It was in this suspended quiet that the bell jingled again. Not Carlos this time. The man who entered was unfamiliar, perhaps early 40s, dressed simply but with an air of quiet observation. He moved with none of the hurried purpose of the tourists, his gaze thoughtful as it swept over the shelves. He wasn't looking for souvenirs. His eyes, dark and intelligent, paused on the traditional pieces, then scanned deeper into the shop, finding the shadowed corner where her unfinished work resided. He didn't approach it, respecting the invisible boundary, but Elena saw the flicker of genuine interest. "Buenos tardes," he said, his voice soft, a contrast to the harsh sunlight outside. "You have some beautiful pieces." He gestured towards a simple, unglazed pitcher, its form clean and honest. "The texture here, it feels very true to the earth." Elena nodded, surprised by the specificity of his comment. Most people just saw pottery. "Gracias. It's a local clay. I can tell." He picked up a small bowl, turning it over in his hands. He wasn't assessing its price, but its weight, its balance. "My name is Mateo." He offered a slight, almost hesitant smile. "I'm a writer. I'm researching traditional crafts in Andalusia for a project." A writer. It explained the observant eyes, the careful way he handled the pottery. "Elena," she offered, wiping a dusty hand on her apron before realizing there was no handshake offered, just a quiet regard. "You are the artist?" "I run the shop," she clarified, a familiar deflection. "Some pieces are mine." "Ah," he looked around again, his gaze lingering on the back corner. The ones with more soul, perhaps? Elena felt a flush creep up her neck. Soul. Who spoke of soul when buying pottery? "They are experiments," she murmured. He didn't press. turning his attention back to the simpler pieces. He asked about her technique, the firing process, the history of certain designs. His questions were different from the usual tourist inquiries. They weren't about function or price, but about intention, about the conversation between the maker and the material. He listened intently to her answers, his head tilted slightly, making her feel, for the first time in a long time, heard. He eventually chose a small, unassuming vase, its surface marked with the subtle imperfections she usually tried to hide. "This one," he said. "It has character." He paid, his fingers brushing hers briefly as she handed him the wrapped piece. An insignificant contact, yet it sent a strange tremor through her. "May I come back sometime?" he asked, pausing at the door. "I'd like to hear more about your process, if you wouldn't mind." Elena hesitated, a flicker of unfamiliar caution, warring with an equally unfamiliar pull. "If I am not busy," she said, the qualification automatic. He smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "Gracias, Elena." Then he was gone, leaving the scent of dust and jasmine slightly disturbed, the silence subtly rearranged. Elena looked at her hands, then towards the unfinished sculpture. A tiny, unexpected fissure had opened in the smooth surface of her resignation. Matteo did come back. Not the next day, but 2 days later, during the quiet lull of the late afternoon. He brought a small notebook this time, asking questions that delved deeper, not just into technique, but into inspiration. "Where does the form come from, Elena? Do you sketch first, or does the clay tell you what it wants to be?" No one had ever asked her that. Not Carlos, who saw the shop as income. Not Sophia, her pragmatic baker friend, who admired her skill but treated her art like any other commodity. Elena found herself explaining the pull of memory, the way the curve of a hill or the texture of weathered wood could translate into a line, a shape. Matteo listened, nodding, occasionally jotting something down, but mostly just watching her face, his attention a palpable thing. Their conversations became islands in the slow-moving river of her days. He'd appear quietly, sometimes buying a coffee from the nearby bar and bringing one for her, settling onto the worn wooden stool near her workspace. They spoke of clay, of course, but soon the talk drifted. He spoke of books, of cities he'd visited, of the frustrating search for the right words to capture a feeling. He was researching authenticity, he said, how traditions endure or fade in the modern world, but his interest felt intensely personal, focused on her. He asked about her life, gently probing the edges of her reserve. Elena found herself revealing small things, her brief time studying art in Madrid before family duty called her back, the stifling weight of expectation in a small town, the quiet ache of dreams deferred. She skirted around the deepest silences, the hollow space left by the child she never held, but she felt him sense the shadows nonetheless. "It's hard, isn't it?" he said one afternoon, watching her hands effortlessly shape a rising cylinder on the wheel. To keep the creative fire alive when life demands so much ash for the hearth. Ash for the hearth. The phrase resonated deep within her. He saw. He understood the quiet sacrifices, the slow banking of embers. After his visits, Elena felt a restless energy hum beneath her skin. She started sketching again, not the predictable tourist designs, but fluid, abstract shapes that echoed the lines of her unfinished sculpture. She found herself lingering in the workshop after closing, the familiar scent of damp clay suddenly alive with possibility. She rearranged her schedule subtly, ensuring she was alone during the hours Matteo was likely to visit. A small deception, yet it felt significant, a secret garden cultivated in the arid landscape of her routine. Carlos remained oblivious, consumed by the worsening drought and the fate of his olive groves. His conversations were filled with brittle leaves, dusty earth, the failing pump. He needed her support, her presence, but his need felt like another layer of dryness, absorbing her moisture without offering replenishment. Sophia, during their brief chats over coffee at her bakery next door, noticed a change. "You seem distracted, amiga," she said, her sharp eyes missing little. "Dreaming of a lottery win?" Elena forced a smile. "Just the heat, Sophia. It makes everyone slow." But Sophia frowned, unconvinced. "Be careful, Elena. Dreams can burn hotter than the sun here." The warning hung in the air, smelling faintly of yeast and cinnamon. Elena pushed it away. The connection with Matteo felt like finding shade after years in the glare. It wasn't burning her. It was soothing her. Or so she told herself. The guilt was a small, insistent pebble in her shoe, easily ignored most of the time, but sharp when stumbled upon unexpectedly, like when Carlos reached for her hand one evening, a rare gesture of connection, and her first instinct was to pull away, her thoughts still lingering on Matteo's quiet understanding. One sweltering afternoon, Matteo arrived with a small, cloth-wrapped package. "A small thank you," he said, placing it gently on her workbench, "for your time, your insights." Inside was a book of poetry by Lorca, bound in soft leather. Elena traced the gold lettering, a lump forming in her throat. It had been years since anyone had given her a book. Carlos read the agricultural reports. Sophia preferred magazines. "It's beautiful, Matteo. Thank you." Lorca understood Andalusia, he said softly. The passion beneath the surface, the duende. He looked towards her unfinished sculpture. "Like your work." That evening, Elena read the poems under the dim light of her bedside lamp, the sound of Carlos's steady breathing filling the room. Lorca's words spoke of moonlight and blood, of hidden rivers and silent anguish. They resonated with a frequency she hadn't felt in decades, vibrating along nerves she thought long dormant. She felt seen, not just by Matteo, but by the ghost of a poet who understood the landscape of her soul. The connection deepened, subtly shifting from research to friendship, or perhaps something bordering it. Matteo spoke more of himself, his own struggles with loneliness in Madrid, the transient nature of his work, a past relationship that had ended painfully. He wasn't presenting a perfect image, but one of shared vulnerability, drawing her further into his orbit. He saw the frustration etched around her eyes when she spoke of the limitations of her small shop, the difficulty of reaching a wider audience for her more personal work. "I know a woman," he mentioned casually one day, "Ana Delgado. She runs a small gallery in Seville, focuses on contemporary Andalusian crafts. She has a good eye." He paused, gauging her reaction. "If you were interested, I could mention your work to her. Send her some photos, perhaps." Hope, sharp and unexpected, pierced through Elena's carefully constructed defences. Seville. A real gallery. It was a dream she hadn't dared to entertain in years. "You would do that?" "Of course." He smiled. "Authenticity deserves to be seen." It was a practical offer, a tangible link to a world beyond the Pueblo Blanco, blending his understanding nature with a hint of the helpful man. She hadn't realized she also craved. It made the connection feel less ephemeral, more grounded in possibility. This gesture, more than the poetry or the deep conversations, solidified Matteo's place in her thoughts. He wasn't just an escape, he represented a potential pathway. Meanwhile, the drought tightened its grip. The air crackled with tension. Whispers in the plaza spoke of ruined harvests, of families facing hardship. Carlos grew quieter, lines of worry carved deeper around his eyes. He spent longer hours in the groves, returning covered in dust, his silence heavier than ever. He needed her, Elena knew. He needed her steady presence, her quiet support, the unspoken partnership that had sustained them through lean years and silent grief. But his need felt like chains, anchoring her to a reality that Matteo's presence made her suddenly desperate to escape. The internal conflict intensified. Guilt was no longer a pebble, but a stone weighing her down. The exhilaration of Matteo's attention felt illicit, dangerous. She saw the glances of neighbours, the speculative looks. In a town this small, secrets were fragile things. She started avoiding the main plaza during siesta, suggesting Matteo meet her in the relative anonymity of her workshop's back room. The secrecy added a layer of intimacy, but also amplified her fear. She was playing with fire, and the scent of smoke was beginning to cling to her. The summer reached its zenith, the heat relentless, mirroring the simmering tension within Elena. Matteo's research trip was drawing to a close. He spoke of returning to Madrid, the words falling like stones into the fragile ecosystem of their connection. He visited the shop one late afternoon, the light outside beginning to soften, painting the white walls in hues of apricot and rose. The air in the workshop felt thick with unspoken words. "So," Elena began, her voice carefully neutral, polishing a finished bowl with unnecessary vigour. "Your research is complete?" "Almost." Matteo leaned against the doorframe, watching her hands. "I've gathered more than I expected, especially here." His gaze met hers, holding it. "Talking with you, Elena, it's been the most valuable part. You reminded me what authentic creation feels like, not just in clay, but in living." Elena's breath caught. She focused on the bowl, its smooth surface cool beneath her fingers. "I'll be leaving at the end of the week," he continued quietly. He stepped closer, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, crisp card. His contact information in Madrid. He held it out to her. "I know it's complicated," he said, his voice low, "but if you ever find yourself in Madrid, or if you just want to continue this conversation, I would like that very much." The card felt heavy in her hand, a tangible symbol of a divergent path, a future sketched in faint, uncertain lines. The air vibrated with the implication, the gentle but clear invitation. A door had opened, offering a glimpse of a different life, one where she might be seen, understood, perhaps even celebrated. Hope and fear warred within her, a dizzying, nauseating mix. Before she could form a response, the sound shattered the charged atmosphere. The frantic ringing of the old telephone mounted on the wall by the shop's entrance. It rarely rang with such urgency. Elena snatched it up, her heart suddenly pounding. It was Sophia, her voice tight with panic. "Elena, it's Carlos! There's been an accident at the olive groves. The old pump, it finally gave out, exploded somehow. Garcia found him. He's conscious but hurt. They're bringing him back now." The world tilted. Mateo's presence, the card in her hand, the shimmering possibility of Madrid, all receded, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of the present. Carlos, hurt, needing her. "I'm coming!" Elena slammed the phone down, her mind racing. She turned, seeing Mateo's concerned face, the unspoken question in his eyes. "My husband," she choked out. "He's been hurt. An accident." She looked down at the card in her hand, then towards the door, towards the life that was undeniably, irrevocably hers. The unfinished sculpture in the corner seemed to watch her, its leaning form suddenly accusatory. The heat pressed in, suffocating. Carlos's name echoed in the sudden ringing silence, not a request, but a demand rooted in years of shared history, shared burdens, shared silence. The choice was brutal, immediate. The pull of the unknown, the validated future Mateo represented, versus the urgent, tangible crisis of her known life. Where did she belong? There was no real choice, not in that moment. Duty, love, habit, whatever the complex weave of emotions that bound her to Carlos was called, pulled her with the force of gravity. "I have to go," she said to Mateo, her voice strained. She didn't look at his face, couldn't bear to see the understanding or disappointment there. She thrust his card into her apron pocket without thinking, the sharp edge pressing against her hip. Then she was running, out of the cool sanctuary of the workshop, into the relentless glare of the late afternoon sun, towards the small crowd gathering near her home at the edge of the plaza. Carlos was sitting on a chair brought out from the house, his face pale and etched with pain, his arm crudely bandaged, stained dark. Garcia, the old farmhand, hovered nearby, looking grim. Sophia was there, her practical nature taking over, holding a glass of water to Carlos's lips. He looked up as Elena approached, his eyes finding hers with a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. The anger and stress of the drought were gone, replaced by shock and pain. "Elena," he murmured, his voice weak. She knelt beside him, her hand automatically going to his uninjured arm, feeling the tremor beneath his skin. The details came in fragments, the pump seizing, a piece of metal flying off, a deep gash. Not life-threatening, the local doctor had assured them via Garcia's phone call, but serious enough. He needed stitches, rest. As Elena helped Carlos inside, settling him onto the sofa in the cool, dark living room filled with inherited furniture and the weight of generations, the world outside her immediate concern faded. Mateo, Madrid, the gallery in Seville, they became distant echoes, irrelevant noise against the immediate, pressing reality of Carlos's pain, his need. She cleaned the wound as the doctor had instructed, her hands, usually so attuned to the nuances of clay, surprisingly steady as she applied antiseptic and fresh bandages. Carlos watched her, his usual reserve stripped away by the shock. "It was stupid," he muttered, pushing the old machine too hard. "We needed the water," Elena said softly, meeting his gaze. An understanding passed between them, unspoken, rooted not in shared dreams but in shared struggle. For the rest of that evening, Elena tended to him. She brought him broth, adjusted his pillows, sat quietly beside him as dusk settled. The only sounds the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the distant murmur of the village settling down for the night. The card in her pocket felt like a foreign object, disconnected from this reality. Matteo's quiet attention, his insightful words, seemed like fragments of a dream experienced by someone else. The man beside her, vulnerable and dependent, was her life, flawed, silent, burdened, but hers. It wasn't a revelation born of sudden passion, but a slow, dawning acceptance. The allure of Matteo hadn't been about Matteo himself, not entirely. It had been about the parts of herself he had reflected back at her, the artist, the woman yearning to be seen, the soul craving deeper communication. He had opened a window, shown her what was missing, but he wasn't the missing piece itself. The emptiness was within her, or rather, within the life she had allowed to become muted and routine. The responsibility for filling it, for finding her own voice, rested solely with her. The next few days unfolded in a quiet rhythm of care. Carlos recovered slowly, his injury forcing a stillness upon him that was unnatural. He was more present, less consumed by the demands of the groves. They spoke more, not of deep emotions, but of practicalities, of shared memories, small observations. The silence between them felt less like a wall, more like a familiar, albeit worn, tapestry. Elena learned Matteo had left the village quietly the morning after the accident. Sophia relayed the news gently, her gaze searching Elena's face for reaction. Elena felt a pang, a brief, sharp sense of loss for the might have been, but it was overlaid with a strange sense of peace. The door Matteo had opened hadn't slammed shut. It had simply shown her the room she was already standing in, urging her to redecorate. One afternoon, while Carlos slept, Elena found herself back in the workshop. The air was still thick with the scent of clay and dust, but it felt different, less like a place of resignation, more like a space waiting. Matteo's card was still in her apron pocket. She took it out, looked at the elegant script, Matteo Vidal, Escritor, and the Madrid address. A potential future, a different conversation. She didn't tear it up. She didn't throw it away. Instead, she walked over to the old wooden box where she kept her few cherished letters and tucked it inside, closing the lid firmly. Acknowledging the connection, honouring the catalyst, but placing it firmly in the past. Her gaze fell on the unfinished sculpture. It still leaned, still questioned. But now Elena saw not just stalled dreams and silent grief, but possibility, resilience, the beauty of imperfection. She picked up a tool, its wooden handle smooth and familiar in her grasp. Her hands, no longer hesitant, moved towards the clay. She didn't know exactly what shape it would take, what story it would finally tell. It didn't matter. The act of creation, of engaging with her own dormant voice, was the destination. She began to work, the rhythmic scraping of the tool against the drying clay the only sound in the quiet workshop. The Andalusian sun streamed through the window, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. It was still hot. The cicadas still sang their relentless song, but something fundamental had shifted within Elena. She was still here in the Pueblo Blanco, wife to Carlos, owner of a small ceramics shop. But she was also Elena, the artist, finally ready to shape her own narrative, one stroke, one handful of earth at a time. The sculpture began to transform under her touch, no longer leaning precariously, but slowly, deliberately, finding its balance. Weeks turned into a month. The fierce heat of high summer began to relent, softening into the golden light of early autumn. The olive harvest, though diminished by the drought, was not entirely lost. Carlos, his arm healed, but his perspective subtly altered by his brush with vulnerability, involved Elena more in the decisions, listening to her opinions with a newfound respect. Their conversations didn't magically become profound explorations of the soul, but the silences held less weight, punctuated by shared observations, small jokes, a more comfortable companionship. The rhythm of their life found a new, quieter cadence. Elena continued her work on the sculpture. It became her focus, her private dialogue. She worked on it in the quiet hours, after the shop closed or before the village stirred. It grew slowly, organically, its form becoming bolder, more assertive than anything she had attempted before. It spoke of resilience, of the beauty found in scars, of the deep roots that anchor even when the branches reach for the sun. Sophia noticed the change, not just in the evolving sculpture, but in Elena herself. There was a quiet confidence, a centeredness that hadn't been there before. "That piece," Sophia said one morning, nodding towards the sculpture as she delivered Elena's coffee, "it has fuerza, strength." Elena smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "I think it's finding its voice." She didn't mention Matteo or the Seville gallery contact again. The desire for external validation had lessened, replaced by the intrinsic satisfaction of the work itself. Perhaps one day she would seek out Ana Delgado, perhaps not. The urgency was gone. The important thing was the act of creation, the rediscovery of her own artistic pulse. One cool evening, as the scent of wood smoke began to perfume the air, Elena stood back and looked at the finished sculpture. It dominated the small workshop, raw, powerful, undeniably hers. It wasn't conventionally beautiful, but it was true. It held the memory of grief, the weight of duty, the flicker of rebellion, the quiet strength of endurance. It was her story, told in clay. Carlos came into the workshop, drawn by the prolonged silence. He stood beside her, looking at the sculpture for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the dim light. Elena braced herself for a practical comment, a question about where she would put such a large, unsellable piece. Instead, he reached out, his calloused hand gently touching the rough surface. S2, he said softly. It is you. 2 simple words, yet they held more understanding than years of conversation. He saw her. Not just the wife, the shopkeeper, but the woman who had wrestled with the clay and with herself and emerged with this testament. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness but of quiet release. The deepest yearning to be truly seen, understood in her essence, hadn't required a dramatic escape or a passionate affair. It had required her to first see and understand herself, and then somehow that recognition had rippled outwards. She leaned her head lightly against Carlos's shoulder, a gesture of comfort freely given, freely received. Outside, the Pueblo Blanco settled under a sky full of stars, the ancient rhythms of life continuing. But within the small ceramics shop, something new had taken root, solid and balanced, finding its place in the world. Elena knew the journey wasn't over, that complexities and unmet needs might surface again, as they do in any life. But now she had her hands, her clay, and a rediscovered voice. She was ready to shape whatever came next. The sculpture remained in the workshop, a silent sentinel. It didn't sell, nor did Elena actively try to sell it. It wasn't made for commerce. It was a marker, a statement of intent. Tourists still came, buying the familiar blues and yellows, but sometimes someone would pause, their gaze drawn to the powerful form in the corner, and a different kind of conversation would begin. Elena found herself talking more openly about her process, about the inspiration behind her work, sharing pieces of herself she had previously kept hidden. Her relationship with Carlos continued its quiet evolution. The shared crisis and his acknowledgement of her art had chipped away at the wall of silence, creating small openings for connection. They wouldn't suddenly transform into soulmates, sharing every intimate thought, but there was a renewed tenderness, a deeper, unspoken respect. He started spending a little time in the workshop occasionally, not saying much, but watching her work with a quiet curiosity that felt like support. He even clumsily tried his hand at the wheel one afternoon, resulting in a lopsided, endearing mess that made them both laugh, a sound Elena realized had become too rare in their house. She thought of Matteo sometimes, not with longing, but with a sense of gratitude. He had been the catalyst, the mirror that showed her the parts of herself she had neglected. The card remained in the wooden box, a reminder not of a lost love, but of a moment of awakening. She didn't need Madrid or a gallery spotlight to feel validated anymore. The validation came from the feel of the clay under her hands, from the honesty of the forms she created, from the quiet acknowledgement in her husband's eyes. One crisp autumn morning, Elena opened the shop to find a small package addressed to her, bearing a Madrid postmark. Her heart gave a slight jolt, but she opened it calmly. Inside was a newly published book, Matteo's book on Andalusian crafts. Tucked within the pages was a simple note. Elena, your insights were invaluable. Thank you for sharing your duende. I hope life is treating you kindly, Matteo. There was also a folded flyer for Ana Delgado's gallery in Seville.